Всем привет! Мне кажется, что мы готовы начинать. Меня зовут Ольга Тенишева, я исполнительный директор образовательной программы Института медиа, архитектуры и дизайна «Стрелка». Лекция сегодняшняя проходит при поддержке мэрии города Иннополис. Я хотела представить сегодняшнего спикера. Это программный директор Института «Стрелка» Браттона, известный социолог, теоретик медиа-дизайна, специалист по диджитал-стратегиям, который преподает в университете в Калифорнии Сан-Диего, является руководителем программы по спекулятивному дизайну. Также преподает в Южно-Калифорнийском университете архитектуры и с лета этого года является программным директором Института «Стрелка». Программа постдипломная, о которой он сегодня немного расскажет, начнется в 2017 году. Вот, не буду задерживать вас, поэтому передаю слово Бенджамину.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and to speak to you here today at this amazing new campus. I want to talk to you about a couple of things for the topic of my presentation, which I'll go. We have about an hour. I'll try to speak for about half an hour, and then we can do the more interesting part of a bit of discussion. First, I want to talk really quickly about some of my more recent work on the philosophy of artificial intelligence, and it's at the urban scale. It's in understanding how it operates at this scale and the implication, and also talk about this this new program at the Strelka Institute in Moscow, which I'm directing, the new normal, which begins next year. You're all enrolled here, so I'm not going to steal you from this university. Though if you leave of your own accord, that's of course a different story. So first, quickly, I am from the University of California at San Diego in La Jolla, which is my main position. On the left, you have the Cal IT 2, which is our main IT and technology institute, sort of analogous to this place. On the right is the Salk Institute. I'm also the director of the Center for Design and Geopolitics at UCSD, which is an interdisciplinary think tank and research unit that brings together artists, architects, urbanists, computer scientists, bioengineers, nanoengineers, cognitive scientists to work on interesting research projects. Our sort of basic motto is that a lot of the emerging technologies that we have at our disposal that we're working with, we don't, as I was saying earlier, we don't really know what they're good for yet. If you look at the history of technology, oftentimes the things that technologies were applied to early on was not really what they ended up being used for in the long term. And so we're interested in exploring the creative space of the possibilities of the technologies and to understand what their cultural, economic, and social potential may be beyond only their mechanical processes. I'm also the author of a couple new books, one of which is called The Stack on Software and Sovereignty, which came out earlier this year from the MIT Press, which makes a sort of larger, comprehensive argument about the planetary scale computation and its impact on political geography, and how we might understand this at multiple scales, from smart grids to cloud computing, smart cities, massive universal addressing system, next generation interfaces like VR and AR, and AI, robotics, so forth and so on. We also founded the new speculative design undergraduate major at UC San Diego, which is also interested in bringing artists and designers working collaboratively with scientists and engineers. Also takes advantage of the fact that we are San Diego's right on the Mexican border. And looking at the geopolitical implications of a lot of these emerging technologies and how they might be used to remake our world in other ways. A lot of my more recent work is on, as I mentioned, is on AI, on artificial intelligence, but more specifically on the cultural or philosophical complexities of AI. One of the interesting things about AI as an advanced technology, as you probably know, is that it evolved very much in relationship to philosophy. In some ways, the philosophy of AI predates actual AI, and that it continues to be in strong dialogue with philosophy, both in being informed by philosophy and philosophy being informed by AI, as it shifted from a kind of top-down symbolic logic model to more bottom-up deep learning and neural network systems. My work around AI, with an interest of what a more robust and sustainable culture of AI might be, is one that's very critical of the anthropocentric notions of AI. And while I think Alan Turing was one of the truly heroic persons of the 20th century, his notion of what we call the Turing test, the idea that we would grant that AI can be said to exist if it passes the threshold of being like human intelligence, or even that it will perform something like intelligence that's similar to how humans think that humans think, that it would therefore be and qualify as AI. I think this has sent AI research down a number of unnecessary and unproductive paths that it's taken a long time for it to come back to. And more importantly, it's shifted the culture of AI on a more popular level in ways that's made it harder for us to understand and make sense of and make use of the way machine intelligence actually does work. On the one hand, one of the problems it does is in the Turing test notion, which I assume you're roughly familiar with, the idea that if you could ask questions of an AI and a person, and you couldn't tell which one was an AI and which one is a person, that therefore that we could say the AI is intelligent. It's this either-or dynamic between the answer, it's either a person or it's an AI that you might be talking to, is never really the case. In the real world, whereas human intelligence and machine intelligence may be quite different, in the real world they're always mixed up. The entity or the machine that you might be interacting with is always a combination of human intelligence and machine intelligence. It's always a kind of hybrid. And that hybrid logic is something we want to be more attentive to. Another important notion is in which we get from more recent work in robotics, particularly evolutionary robotics, is that intelligence is always embodied in some way. It never operates in a purely symbolic level. The ability of the reason that bottom-up robotics have been more successful recently to a large extent is the heuristic capacities that more specialized machines have in their ability to sense and process and make patterned and reasoned judgments about how they might negotiate the world. This is true for AI at any scale, including the urban scale. So I'm going to skip this. Including the urban scale. Now, part of the problem with another problem with the more anthropocentric notion of AI is it presumes also that the future of AI would be based on the way in which we think that humans think. And as David Russell and Peter Norvig, the head of the AI group at Google, intimated, we don't design airplanes to imitate the way birds fly. Why would we design AIs to imitate the way in which we think that ways in which we think that humans think? Now, we think about things that, going to the urban scale very quickly, we think about things like machine vision, network sensing, biosensing, motion sensing, heat sensing. The urban landscape is increasingly becoming a sensory mechanism in its own right. Not a single sensory mechanism like the way in which the senses are organized in a single body, but a landscape of distributed mechanisms. The AIs are, in a way, sensing the world through the interfaces of the city. They're becoming embodied through the interfaces of the city, but differently than, in a way that's evolutionarily different than the way in which vertebrates and other animals evolved. It's not one organism at a time. It's a much more distributed system into which one sensory system might be connected to multiple intelligences and vice versa. Now, the philosophical questions here are also of interest. As we see at the level of the city, where the sensing stops and the information processing begins is always a bit fuzzy. Now, in going back to Immanuel Kant, the idea that there's always been a hierarchy between sensing and thinking. Sensing is sort of a lower thing, and thinking is this higher faculty. We see it the way in which AI is embodied at the level of the city, that they're always mixed up. Well, they're mixed up with us too. And this is a lesson that we would take to heart, that the difference of sensing and thinking is actually much more combined. And so at the end of the day, the argument that we're interested in is not so much how it is that we would teach AIs how to think, but rather how we would recognize the complexity and strangeness of how it is that machine sensing and machine intelligence is working and can work. That we would see intelligence as a much broader thing, a wider spectrum than we'd understood before, and would have a better idea of where our particular case of human intelligence sits along the spectrum. So it's less us teaching AIs how to think than AI teaching us more what thinking is. Okay. Including this I've just finished this piece on Google Deep Dream, which is such an amazing project. Are you familiar with the term apophenia? Do you know this English word apophenia? It's kind of an interesting word. So humans are a pattern recognition. You're familiar with this project? I assume most of you, IT University, might be familiar with this. I'll happy to explain. So Google, this was posted on Google's research blog about 1.5 years ago. They have a face-finding algorithm that will find faces and things. You go on your Facebook page and it'll find your friends' faces and things like this. This particular face-finding algorithm was trained to find the faces of dogs and to differentiate faces of dogs from particular images, which is for a machine learning system rather complicated because dogs look really different from one another. Poodles and Great Danes don't all look the same, and so how you would train it to still categorize all those various things as dog is different than how you would categorize harder than, say, bottle of water, which are roughly the same. So the question was, what if we took a bunch of these images that don't have dogs in them and fed them back into this algorithm over and over and over and over and over again, doing a kind of find edges function, look for dog, find edges, look for function. And the result of these amazing hallucinatory images where they find dogs whether they're actually there or not. So humans are a pattern recognition species. We find patterns of things. This is how we survive. Apophenia is the word for false pattern recognition, where we see patterns that aren't really there. The sort of false positive of pattern recognition. The fact that AI is capable of apophenia too is a kind of extraordinarily interesting. So bottom line, the AI is embodying itself at the scale and level of the city. It does have bodily form, but one that's quite different than the way in which humans do. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about this program at Strelka. The Strelka Institute, as you probably may know, was founded about 8 years ago as an architecture, media, and design school in Moscow. Rem Koolhaas and Amo, the Dutch architecture studio, were the first program directors. We'll be the new program director starting this year for a couple of years. It's a postgraduate degree. It runs from next year, run from February to June for this 5-month period. We'll have 30 students in the cohort, quite international. It's tuition free and your stipend for this as well. And so very quickly, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the things that we'll be working on and we'll be thinking about together. The theme of the program we call the new normal. The new normal refers to the notion that the world in which we live has changed to such a degree that many of the conventional languages and concepts and institutions and forms that we use to describe it, to model it, to predict it, and to design it simply don't work anymore. That we're stuck with a language of hybrids. We talk about combinations of things. We still call these sensor computers that we drag around in our pockets, we still call them phones for some reason. We talk about smart cities. We talk about all kinds of hybrid concepts. It's a little bit of horseless carriages, or languages, which is what they called cars when they were first brought about. The first thing is we need to understand, to think about whether the kind of world that we want to describe and build, we may need a new language to do so. Maybe some of our problems is that we're trying to describe things in a language that simply doesn't work anymore. The other idea that we're focusing on is one we want to think of art and design and emerging technology not as two sides of different disciplines that would come together, but something that's much more interwoven. And we want to think about the space of possibilities of the kind of cities that we're going to build, the kinds of systems that we're going to build, urban systems, food systems, climate systems, logistical systems, experiential systems. Instead of thinking of them in terms of sort of what are we going to build in the next 5 weeks or the next 5 months, thinking of them more in terms of, let's say, 2030, 2050. But instead of thinking of 2050 as the future, in our culture we talk about the future as it's a kind of alibi. Instead of saying once upon a time or in a land far, far away, we say, well, in the future, we sort of defer everything into this other place. Well, in the broad scheme of things, Earth is 4.7 billion years old. We've been around about 125,000 years. 2050 is not the future. 2050 is just the decisions we make today, right now, tonight, and next week, is designing 2050. 2050 is being designed right now. We don't think of it necessarily this way. Design certainly doesn't think of it at this scale, but I would submit to you that if we did design our systems with what I call this a thickened now, we would have better ones in this way. And so we're trying to start from this perspective in this way. So, as I say, when something new appears, we tend to think of it as a kind of combination of things: horseless carriage, computer and camera, we call a phone, so forth and so on. But this language of hybrids ends up costing us too much. In the short term, the hybrids may make sense by way of analogy. They suggest continuity, but as the new evolves and resembles the familiar less and less, they begin to create confusion. They delay recognition and understanding, and prevent us from seeing things as they really are and intervening with them at that level. And so we wish for a kind of productive demystification and disenchantment, so that we might deal with what we call our Anthropocenic precipice more intelligently. Are you familiar with this term, the Anthropocene? You heard this term? So this is an interesting concept, and I think one that applies to technologists and engineers as much as artists and designers. The notion is that since roughly the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, that humans have so thoroughly transformed the geology and climate of the planet, from the ocean acidification to climate change to massive vertebrate species die-off and so forth, that we've entered a new geologic era. The Earth is as permanently different now than it was at the beginning of the Holocene. And so there's the international professional societies of geologists who are responsible for naming eras are in the process of deciding whether or not we have in fact entered the Anthropocene. If so, there's a kind of good news and bad news to this of the Anthropocene. The bad news is that in a short order, roughly 125 years, we've screwed up the common system so thoroughly that we're going to spend at least the next few generations trying to unscrew them. The good news is that we've proven it is possible in relatively short order to geoengineer an entire planet, because we've done it once. Now we need to do it a bit more intelligently. So, the context of which we're working is Russia, Moscow in particular, but Russia more generally. One of the things that we're particularly interested in is Russia in the Anthropocene, and its relationship to, and both positive and negative in relationship to climate transformations. We're interested in Russia's history of futurism and the way in which previous futurist legacies within the Russian tradition might be reactivated in new and creative and productive ways. We're interested in the way in which both the real and imagined space program has, from as early as the 19th century, particularly in Russia, was a way of thinking about a planetary civilization, of thinking about Earth as a single site condition, what Buckminster Fuller called spaceship Earth. Regardless of whether we ever leave, the perspective that it gives us to see from the outside is enormously productive. So, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about we basically will be doing, our program is organized into these six modules. The first one is that I'll be leading is called the new normal, where we will be going through the stack thesis, which I've described a little bit as well, from Earth layer, cloud layer, city layer, address layer, interface layer, and finally the user layer on top. That's us. The next module will be directed by Lev Menovich, the Russian new media and big data new media theorist and big data scientist, who has innovated what was called cultural analytics, which is the use of big data methodologies to do cultural analysis. And as I say, one of the things that we're interested in around big data analysis is on pattern recognition. This is a good example of apophenia. We see patterns even when we know patterns are false. Even when you know the pattern's not really there, we can't help but see them. One of the things that big data analysis allows us to do is to differentiate differentiate correlation and causality, to understand what is in fact is a real cause and effect from what only appears to be this way, and to see patterns that we couldn't otherwise see, to understand the way the world works in ways in which we couldn't possibly understand before, that we've no way we could intuitively perceive, in the same way a telescope or a microscope allows us to perceive things about the world we could never intuitively perceive anymore. So Lev will be directing this. We'll have a module called synthetic sensing, where students will be learning a number of different, learning to work with a number of different emerging technologies of scenario development, storytelling, and also experience design, including virtual and augmented reality. This is a prototype film made by Keiichi Matsuda, based in London, who it looks like we'll probably have coming and teaching one of the modules here as well. Of course, we're interested in how it is that there's a certain point by which, I guess we're talking about machine sensing at the level of the city and so forth. There's a point by which the development of artificial sensing capabilities, machine sensing and network sensing, and the augmentation of natural sensing of like through VR and AR, they begin to merge and come together in strange new ways. Those strange new ways is where we'd like to start and find out what's a bit possible to do, including this is a project by John Rogers, University of Illinois, of epidermal sensing. We'll be doing a lot of projects using LiDAR. It's a tremendously interesting post-photographic way of modeling spaces. And of course, we want integrating the LiDAR and the VR together. Next module is called Speculative Megastructures, be led by Liam Young, Keller Easterling. Megastructures have been a way in which architectural discourse has thought about total social systems for quite some time. Now our total social systems look a little bit different. They may have a different kind of valence to them. They include things like the cloud, not just cities as well. Liam Young is an architect based in London and Los Angeles, whose work is on sort of imagining and working with these the speculative megastructures. He does a lot of filmmaking with drones and other sort of things as well, all very wonderful. Also Keller Easterling, whose work has more to do with the social and cultural and economic underpinnings of these kinds of projects and systems. For whom are these worlds made? How do they work? What kinds of pathologies do they introduce? How do issues of sovereignty and citizenship confuse them, or are supported by them? We will be doing a field trip to California, where students will be touring a number of places in California. By the way, also has a bear and a red star. We'll be first going to La Jolla, where we'll be down near San Diego, where the biotech industry. We'll be looking at the kinds of design that they're doing there. Up to Los Angeles, we'll be visiting SciArc and YouTube and looking at media design, and then up to the Silicon Valley. Up here, we'll be meeting with some of the large and small companies to understand those different cultures of innovation. And then lastly, we'll be working with the Dutch design studio Metahaven, who are one of the most important graphic design studios in the world right now, but also increasingly doing a lot with in cinema and film. And so, in the development of the development of the student projects as platforms, as products, as services, as brands, as narratives, as worlds that would make a kind of strong argument about what we may want to have happen, Daniel and Vinka are the ideal people to work with. And so, a little bit of an overview of how this will be working. We're also seeing this as a 3-year collaboration among this group of faculty who will also be doing a lot of new works together. So, as I mentioned, one of the things that design is quite good at, and something that we like to do when we're working with technologists, is around the issues of modeling. There's at least 3 kinds of models that design has the ability. One we call descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. Descriptive or analytical models are models that are meant to describe the world as it actually is and try to find patterns in something as the world as it may be at this particular point in time. Those may tell us something we didn't know before. We also have predictive models that are not meant to describe things as they are, but are meant to anticipate what is most likely to happen. The guys on Wall Street mostly work with predictive models. And then we have projective or speculative models, which are meant to describe not the way it is, not what's most likely to happen, but what we would like to happen. And sometimes what we see where these kind of get mixed up in different sort of ways. Design tends to be focusing on the third, the projective or speculative model. You don't hire an architect to tell you what's the most likely building that's going to go there. You tell them what's the one that should go there. And different sort of it was as well. And so we will be working across really all 3 of these. Students will come from a number of different places. We're really interested in the development of new kinds of interdisciplinary, technology-driven design practices. You know, if this is the old model of design, this is the new model of design. We're interested in how they all can blend together in new and interesting ways. How people, as I say, would pick 3 and build a practice from this as well. And then we would ultimately develop a kind of what we call the Strelka school of thought, which may have multiple different export functions. So, last word. Design always does its best work in relationship, not with a clean sheet of paper or tabula rasa, but in relationship to an emergency. So now we've got lots of emergencies to pick from. We have the Anthropocenic ecological emergency, we have securitarian and geopolitical emergencies, we've got financial emergencies. So take your pick. The one thing to think about in terms of the emergency is in English, the word means both a state of crisis and a state of emergence. You want to put your allegiance with the emergence. Don't design on behalf of the crisis, design on behalf of the emergence. So, anyway, there's the emergence for us to work with. Last word, future has not been canceled. Thank you for your time. So with whatever time we have left, I wanted to have a little bit of a conversation, talk about some of these ideas that we've put on the table and get a bit of a dialogue going. Yes,
First question is maybe mostly connected to this place. So most of people here are computer scientists or future computer scientists. So how can a computer scientist benefit from this program?
Well, the wonderful thing about computer science and about software and hardware design in general is that has been said in a number of different ways, software is eating the world. Everything is computer science at a certain kind of degree. If not in 2016, as increasingly. We were talking earlier about blockchain systems, where certain kinds of value systems and trading systems are become software. Ecological governance becomes software. Politics is becoming software. Anthropology is becoming software. To be a computer scientist is to learn a set of skills so that you can write and compose code. The parts of society or the parts of an economy or the parts of a culture where that code lives and where that code does something, or in the city, at the scale of the city, that's a different question. And so I think in a certain way, one should always be, I mean, I have a lot of students who are computer science at art or computer science design or computer science something. I think in many ways, unless you're doing very theoretical work or very specifically narrowly focused work, which may be very important and interesting, in most cases, people should, I think, be computer science and something else, because they're writing code that will do something else, and you want to have an understanding and an expertise of what that context is that you might be building for. If you're going to replace something in the world, know something about it, including cities. Yeah, please.
So you mentioned some projects, somehow connected to artificial intelligence, virtual reality is kept it, fastly, but can you expand a little bit about the projects? What are the projects?
I'm not sure I don't understand your question.
You mentioned that.
I'm writing the project on AI that I'm doing is a book for MIT Press. So I'm not doing any original engineering or coding work in artificial intelligence. The book is in the trajectory of philosophy and philosophy of AI, and it's a book I'm doing for MIT Press, which will come out. Yeah.
Can you learn about the book, about the slides you showed? There are some activities during the program, this postgraduate program.
At Strelka.
Yeah.
Oh, on synthetic sensing. Yes. So the students will be doing work with a number of different kinds of machines of machine sensing systems at urban scale, including LiDAR systems, including robotic drawing systems, and a number of other kinds of things, which we're trying to incorporate into now.
What kind of work do they do with that?
In this case, for the workshop we're doing is just getting the students familiar with the use of the technology so that they can be incorporated into the other design projects that they're developing in a sort of ways. Like what projects they'll end up doing once we could set them loose with these skills and these tools, I don't know yet. Check back with me in June. It'll be something weird, I'm sure.
Okay, because it will be a great idea to combine these sensors with some new ideas that they produce.
That's the idea. That's exactly the idea. With the presumption that we don't know what they're good for yet, and just tracking cars is maybe very helpful, but is not the most interesting thing we can think of. Yeah.
So the student don't have any kind of final project, so
yes.
It is not going to be implemented in any way in the city, so they're just studying.
Not in June. It may be implemented in, the goal, as I say, the real goal of the program is to support the development of kinds of interdisciplinary, creative-driven, technology-driven design practices that are more common in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, New York, London, but not as common here, though there's no reason they couldn't be. That obviously Russia has a tremendously rich mathematics, science, engineering tradition and background, tremendously rich literature, art, philosophy, and there's no reason it can't be a powerhouse in these things coming together in these forms of design practice. So the real outcome is the design practices themselves. The projects that the students will develop in June is a means to an end in that regard. That with a number of other things that we have in the works for how it is that those projects themselves will be distributed and publicized and viewed and beyond the campus and beyond Moscow. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is it going to be?
It depends. Yeah, I would say it depends on the project that people are doing. If people are developing a software platform, there's no reason we can't launch this platform, and we're happy to do this. And this is and we do this with my student projects all the time. Or if there's startups that may come out of the project with this as well. I've spun several startups out of the lab at UC San Diego, and there's no reason we can't do it there. Other projects may be ones in which that have a real and important influence on how something is developed, but they're not going to be launched anytime soon. Right.
Do you think the city administration will welcome this kind of projects, like in terms of Moscow, for example, if students come up with something that is like they can be implemented in the city? Do you think? Have you thought about it?
Yeah.
How is it going to
Well,
be?
yeah, Strelka KB is the part of the Strelka Institute that has a more of a focus on the specific redesign of the cities, and been doing a lot of work on Moscow recently. I think our brief is a little bit larger than just Moscow. We're looking at the region more broadly. Students are going to looking at. We're doing also. I didn't mention we're doing a trip to Murmansk in the north. One of the things that one of the issues we're interested in is robotics at the scale of the city. Two of the places, strangely enough, that you may see robotics used most broadly at scale of the city are in shipping ports, logistical facilities, and agriculture, where you have, also in California, where you have these sort of structures as well. And so in Murmansk, there's a huge development of building a logistic port city up there that will be largely automated. There's a race between Russia and Norway and Canada to build port cities along the Arctic Sea quickly enough to build the northern passage for when the North Pole melts. You can send containers across the surface. So you've got these three countries competing to build the robot cities at the top of the planet. They'll be sending containers to and from each other. So if you want to go work on automation in the city, you go to where the robots are.
Can I
Yeah,
please?
please.
What do you think, what will be the next step after that process, the merging between machines and humans, when all information will be summarized and this process will be finished? What do you think is the next step? Not 2050, but maybe, 2090 years.
I don't know I guess I always answer the question in a few different ways. On the one hand, the idea that humans and technologies were ever separate is one of the things I think we've discovered how wrong that idea was. As they become more together, we realize they've always been together, that humans have evolved in relationship to our technologies have evolved in relationship to the human. I mean, we have opposable thumbs and 5 fingers and binocular vision because of the tools that we've used over these millions of years. We are an artifact of the technology as much as the technology is an artifact of us. And so from the kind of information exchange standpoint, we've always been interrelated. We've always been cyborgs in one way or another. And so it may be, the question is, why did we ever think it was different? Why did we ever think it was separate? Now, in terms of AI, I mean it in the AI and the linking, I mean it in a specific way. I don't mean it in terms of in the future we'll mix together and that we'll have a complete convergence between mammal intelligence and silicon intelligence in a sort of Ray Kurzweil sort of way. I'm actually debating Ray Kurzweil in November. I find his take on AI to be very problematic. What I mean is something more like, you know what Amazon's Mechanical Turk is, where you go on, you can pay somebody to do something. Well, you've got like a cloud platform that there's actually a human behind, but then that human is using the cloud platform to do the work, and then there's a human behind that, and so it's sort of a human cloud, layers upon layers upon layers. That's what I mean by it's always mixed. And that's why the idea of the Turing test, where like we're going to find out finally, was it a person or was it a machine? Well, in the real world, it's always a mix. It's always a mixture of both. I think the question is that doesn't answer the question, though, of what kind of society of mixture we actually want. When you have an economy if you have an economy that's so thoroughly automated that much of the kind of work that we used to do could be done by machines, it doesn't answer the question of how do we take care of each other. It doesn't answer the question of what kinds of cities do we want. All of those that opens those questions up again, but it doesn't answer them. So we want to figure out what the possibilities of that are. Does that make sense? Okay, yeah. That's what I was saying a word that before. Sometimes I don't like to think about it in terms of the future, as if there's sort of a linear path that we just get on the train and we'll eventually get there. We can predict which way it goes. It's more like it's rules, but it's more of roll of the dice. I mean, the future that's possible is the ones that we end up making, and I think that if we have a more, how do I put it, demystified, disenchanted, maybe a more secular view of how things are actually working, one in which some of our anthropocentric biases don't have such a strong impact, we'll be better able to make some of the futures that we actually want. Yeah.
Another futuristic question. It's mostly about today's situation and how it will evolve. Because, as you mentioned, it's good, like a good example, how the merging of human and machines will be present. So one day we will not distinguish, and today we cannot distinguish between who is doing the work for us. Like, you enter some service and then you don't know whether the human is sitting behind the service or it's just the machine intelligence.
It's always going to be both.
And
except in very, very rare artificial services.
Even now there are services that start with machine learning algorithms to communicate with you, like answer simple questions, and then when the time comes, it's now human. So sometimes those deep learning systems have learned from millions of human cases. So it's really the humans that are training it anyway. I mean that today it's sometimes obvious to check this. And I think that the strategy of creating more and more complex algorithms is to make more and more things that can be done by the machine without a human in the loop. So human can train the machine, but still cannot use human in this loop. Yeah. And the next step is all these algorithms and all these people are doing things for us. So this is our needs, our problems, and these algorithms and people are solving our problems. But one day, maybe, the algorithms would see that there are a better way to do the things. We train them, but one day they say, this is not the proper way to do this.
Not one day. That's why, I mean, there's another question where I see this kind of machine intelligence really is what in philosophy is called the other mind problem. When you encounter another mind that thinks the world totally differently than you do, maybe because it's embodied in the world very differently than you, how is it possible for that to be communication with it? I was thinking of like Tarkovsky's Solaris, the aliens trying to communicate with these little primate creatures, but it just can't because it's embodied in the world very differently. I think our encounter with AI is probably similar. And when you see things like the Move 37 in the AlphaGo, the Go program, where like Move 37, I think in Game 2, where the AI makes this move in Go that's so unlike anything a human ever would have done, and it ends up being genius. Those are signals that like there's some, not just that there's a kind of that it's smart in some way, but there's an alien way of thinking that's present here that we might learn from. So I don't think that's a futuristic scenario. That's my point. I think these are things we might see all around us. We may see these in the way in animal systems. We may see these in biochemical systems. We may learn to see intelligence in the world and appreciate it in ways that's always been there once we get better at modeling it artificially ourselves.
Okay, just the additional question, what can be the request from of this another. So now we're requesting things to now enlarge our area of habitation, to reach the stars or whatever. This is our request. We want food, we want to live longer. But what will be the requests from this alien brain?
Batteries.
What?
Batteries.
No. And only batteries. Because
Yeah, I don't know.
No.
Yeah, we'll have to find out.
So you mentioned anthropocentric biases. What are they?
How long do we have? On the anthropocentric, what's that? Well, the way in which we think of AI in terms of its structures in terms that it modeled entirely on the human, the way in which we design, we think of the practicality of design problems and design solutions based on the time span of how long the average Homo sapien is likely to be alive. The way in which that we only perceive models of intelligence that are ones that seem like ourselves. The ways in which our art and humanities prioritize the way in which the experience of human experience as being fundamentally the most important artistic and philosophical questions, as opposed to ones in which experience is understood more materially. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on, but there's a longer sort of question. I mean, let me answer this in terms of this notion of the Anthropocene, the idea of the geologic era that humans have made. So there's a couple ways one way in which I think about this is it's not just the era that humans as a species, Homo sapiens, 125,000 years old, have done, which it is, but it's other things as well. We've done this, in this incredibly instantaneous moment of 150 years, which in terms of the span of the Earth is basically instantaneously have transformed this process, not just because we became a dominant species, but in a certain way because of humanism, of an idea that our experience and our cultures and our symbolic systems are in fact more real than they actually are. And I think that the kinds of the demystifications and disenchantments that are necessary in order to get us into a better perspective would be ones that would shift that bias. I call these shifts of bias, I call these Copernican traumas. So, you know Copernicus, yes, okay. So, Copernican traumas are these moments in which, a way in which we used to think that our intuitive perspective of the world was in fact the center of everything and was in fact real, that the sun goes up, the sun goes down, our planet's in the center of things, that we in fact understand, we're able to get outside of our intuitive understanding of the world and to see it as it really is and to understand that we are not the center of something. So Copernican Darwinian biology was a Copernican trauma. Neuroscience that demystifies the experience of mind is a Copernican trauma. Genomics is a Copernican trauma. Queer theory is probably a Copernican trauma in that it shifts the binary logic of the sexes towards something that's more of a material continuity. There's lots of kinds of Copernican traumas, each of which would shift and destabilize a particular kind of humanist subject to see the world more as it really is. All of those are good things. Copernican traumas are priceless accomplishments in their own right. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. And I think you didn't touch the question of whether the artificial intelligence is dangerous to humanity or not. I mean,
it can be, sure. Yeah.
This question is frequently touched in the past maybe 2 or 3 years, right? For example.
Yeah.
What do you think about this problem? I mean, you touched this recently just now because you said that something alien may appear in the inference or in the reasoning of the artificial intelligence.
Not an alien, but something that is alien to us in this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Possibly it's dangerous.
Yes. So you're familiar with Eliezer Yudowski's what he calls the paperclip maximizer problem. So this is an example of the runaway AI. So in AI research, there's a difference between what's called artificial idiocy and artificial stupidity. Artificial stupidity is when you sort of throttle down the AI so that it's less smart than it really could be. So like the chess program on your phone. When you put it to level 1, it's playing not as well as it can. It's throttled down to be artificially stupid, so it's fun for you to play it. Artificial idiocy, on the other hand, describes something very different. That describes when an AI doesn't break down. It causes tremendous harm, not because it breaks down, not because there's a glitch, not because there's a bug, and not because it had any malevolent intention towards humans, but because it does exactly what it was programmed to do, to such an idiotic extreme that it causes some catastrophic harm. And the example that the paperclip maximizer parable is of an AI that's programmed to turn things into paperclips. So that could be helpful. You turn this into a paperclip, and now you don't, or this into a paperclip. And it becomes so successful at turning molecules into paperclips that it goes insane and turns everything into paperclips, and there's nothing left of the planet because all atoms have been transformed into paperclips. So many paperclips, so little paper. So the danger with AI is probably not the Skynet scenario where it really... I mean, this is an interesting thing about... Here's back to the anthropocentric bias in the culture of AI. When we think about the danger of AI and the danger it has both practical but also philosophical or conceptual to the idea that we're the primary intelligent, our model of intelligence is central and primary, we still find a way to make ourselves the center of the story. You think like Spielberg's movie AI, where the little boy AI wants to be a human with all his little AI heart, right? It's a Pinocchio story. Like the real aspiration the AI has is ultimately to achieve the status of human. Or Skynet, where once it becomes online in the Terminator movies, it's obsessed with the genocide of humans. But one way or the other, we're still the center of its obsession in its story. And it may be, as I say, that the really scary situation is not one in which the AI wants to be you or the AI wants to kill you, but one in which it doesn't even understand you as an interesting thing to know about, where we're irrelevant. Yeah, this is right. And so I think there's catastrophic danger, existential risk dangers of AI that Nick Bostrom deals with, which are I think interesting to think about and probably wise to take precautions against. But the more prosaic, boring dangers of AI are ones that are probably more likely to have problems. The French philosopher Paul Virilio has this great line where he says that the invention of any technology is also the invention of a new kind of accident. The invention of the train is also the invention of the train crash. The invention of the stock market is also the invention of the stock market crash, and so on and so on. So what the accident that's implicit, the kinds of boring, prosaic, everyday accidents that are implicit in AI are probably the ones that we really need to be spending more time worrying about. And for that, I think that Musk's OpenAI initiative is probably a more practical way to spend our time thinking about than the Machine Intelligence, the MIRI Machine Intelligence Research Institute sort of way of thinking about the big catastrophic era. It's the little accidents that'll kill us, not the big ones.
From a philosophical point of view, what kind of ethical moral problems related to human and AI integration could arise here in the future years? So let's say in this century.
There's a term. So what we could think about the problem of anthropomorphic AI. That is AI that's artificially made to be human-like because we prefer it that way. We could think about that at a social scale as what was called sociomorphic AI. That AI that's trained, it ends up sort of amplifying all the worst tendencies in an entire society. And it makes all kinds of mistakes. There's a lot of controversy now about the use of machine learning systems in American police departments to do crime prediction, for example. Or the use of machine learning systems to do make home loan decisions. And what tend to do is oftentimes these aren't really anything like AI systems. They've sort of been sold this stuff. But they end up making really bad decisions. They end up making really bad decisions that if they were made by humans, would be sort of, would be ones that are amplifying all of the worst tendencies and prejudices of race, class, and gender in how it is that we misinterpret information. So I think part of the ways in which is that you have AI that is just amplifies. It can amplify our own stupidity as much as it can, as much as it could teach us something new. The value of it would be the opposite. It would be the Move 37 problem, where it actually allows us to find and deduce a pattern in how issues like crime or financial risk might actually work. Not the way we think they work, not the way we've intuitively understood them to work, not the way our dumb tribal prejudices have made us think that they work, but the way in which they might actually work. They could teach us something quite interesting if we're ready for it. So I think part of the ethical issue is not just how do we train the AIs not to do dumb stuff, but how do we have an ethics in relationship to the AI that we're willing to learn from them. We're willing to learn that the world works in a different way than we thought it did. I think that's an ethical position.
So there is this conception that AI can make dumb stuff because
it's just a calculator.
Train it on data that is already biased. What do you think?
Garbage in, garbage out.
Solve this issue? How can we make the data not biased?
Aha.
How can we collect this data and make it less biased and make it not concentrate on prejudices?
Well, I think the first thing is to probably start with a general understanding that there's no such thing as unbiased data. The data isn't like strawberries that you go out there and pick and put in the basket, and if you get enough of the strawberries, you can make something out of it. What you choose to be data and how you structure and give hierarchy to the data is already producing a model of what you're describing. And so probably if we have a broad conversation, we have a great deal of data literacy at a societal level, that we can actually have that conversation about what data should be used to describe a particular phenomenon. It would be possible to build systems that are more socially resilient in that way. It's possible at limited scale. I mean, if we can actually, models are models, right? They can be functional. At the extent to which their functions and their outcomes are relatively curtailed, sure, it's possible to do it in small level. But as it scales, it becomes exponentially more complicated. And so you may have Model A or Model B that are describing and learning about a particular, what we understand to be the same phenomenon. They see it totally differently. They give totally different answers, and they're both in their own way correct. The question is how do we make use of that, and how do we learn from what it sees? And we can't just abdicate that to the AI. That's something that involves our own ethical allegiances. Yeah. We got to run. Okay.